Ukraine came a step closer on Tuesday to winning the fleet of modern battle tanks it hopes could turn the course of the war against Russia, after the West's big holdout Germany said this would be the first item on its new defense minister's agenda. In the central city of Dnipro, authorities called an end to the search for survivors in the ruins of an apartment building destroyed during Russian missile attacks on Saturday. 44 people were confirmed killed and 20 still unaccounted for in the attack, the deadliest for civilians of a 3-month Russian missile bombardment campaign. 79 people were wounded and 39 rescued from the rubble. Nearly 11 months after Russia invaded, Kyiv says a fleet of Western battle tanks would give its troops the mobile firepower to drive Russian troops out in decisive battles in 2023. German-made Leopard battle tanks, workhorse of armies across Europe, are widely seen as the only plausible option available in sufficient numbers. But they cannot be delivered without authorization from Berlin, which has so far demurred. With Western allies meeting at a U.S. airbase in Germany on Friday to pledge military support for Ukraine, Berlin is under intense pressure to lift its objections this week, in what would be one of the most consequential shifts in Western aid so far. The decision sits on the desk of Germany's new defense minister Boris Pistorius, named on Tuesday to replace Christine Lambrecht, who quit after missteps including a cheerful New Year's message about the war that opponents called tone-deaf. Germany has been cautious about approving weapons that could be seen as an escalation. But allies increasingly argue that concern is misplaced, with Russia showing no sign of backing down from its assault on its neighbor. Britain broke the taboo over heavy tanks over the weekend, pledging a squadron of its Challengers. But it has too few to form the basis of a Ukrainian force. Washington's Abrams tanks run on turbine engines, seen as burning too much fuel for Ukraine to field in large numbers. That leaves the Leopards, which Germany made in the thousands during the Cold War and which are now fielded by armies across Europe. Poland and Finland have already said they would send Leopards if Berlin gives re-export approval. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions driven from their homes since Russia launched what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine in February last year. Ukrainian forces drove Russian troops back during the second half of 2022. But over the past 2 months the front lines have largely been frozen in place despite both sides enduring heavy losses in relentless fighting. Ukrainian officials say tanks would be key to breaking the stalemate. Russia claims to have captured the small mining town of Soldar on the outskirts of the eastern city of Bakhmut last week. Kyiv has said it is still fighting there. Moscow, meanwhile, has turned since October to a tactic of raining missiles down on Ukrainian cities far from the front, mainly targeting electricity infrastructure. Russia says it aims to reduce Ukraine's ability to fight. Kyiv says the attacks serve no military purpose and are intended to harm civilians, a war crime. In Dnipro, residents left flowers and cuddly toys at a makeshift memorial near the apartment block destroyed during Russia's wave of missile attacks on Saturday. Moscow denies intentionally targeting civilians and blamed Ukraine's air defenses for the missile that hit the apartment block. Kyiv says it was hit by a notoriously inaccurate Russian anti-ship missile for which Ukraine has no defenses. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his Monday night video address that the attack on Dnipro and Russia's attempts to gain the initiative in the war underscored the need for the West to speed up decision-making in supplying weapons. Russia attacked Ukraine on February 24, saying Kyiv's close ties with the West created a security threat. Ukraine and its Western allies call it an unprovoked war to seize land and impose Russia's will on its neighbor. Dozens of people were killed and many more wounded in just one brutal attack on a massive apartment building in the city of Dnipro. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the search for survivors after the Saturday missile strike went on all weekend, with at least 30 people killed and as many more missing under the vast pile of rubble. Many people were inside the apartment block when Russia launched 2 waves of missile strikes. Haunting images emerged all weekend of rescuers working day and night to find survivors amid the crumbled concrete, glass and steel. They'd pause now and then to listen for voices beneath the rubble. Anastasia Shvets, 23, was one of the lucky ones whose voice carried over the dust and din to reach the rescuers' ears. She was in the bathroom of her 7th-floor apartment when the missile struck. Shvets had already lost her husband on the front lines of the war against Russia's invaders. Now her home, far from the battlefield, has been taken, too. Katerina, another young resident of the building, was pulled alive from the rubble more than 18 hours after the attack. But as each hour passed, hope of finding more survivors grew dimmer. For the Russian Defense Ministry, it was mission accomplished. It said Russia's military goals had been achieved with the weekend strikes. As missiles pounded cities across Ukraine, ground fighting intensified in the fiercely contested towns of Soledar and Bakhmut. Ukrainian soldiers are battling to hold on to the neighboring towns, which sit right on the edge of Russian-occupied territory. They're also fighting for their lives, up against a relentless onslaught of Russian mercenaries from what's known as the Wagner Group, a private army run by an ally of President Vladimir Putin. Many of the fighters have been recruited from prisons across Russia, with the promise of release after they serve in Putin's war on Ukraine. The deadly missile strikes over the weekend and the grinding battle for the frontline towns in the eastern Donbass region gave Ukrainian officials another grim example to point to as they ask supporters in the US and Europe for more support and more weapons. As part of that support, the US military has expanded its direct combat training of Ukrainian troops, with a new program starting in Germany over the weekend. The goal, according to US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, is to get a battalion of about 500 Ukrainian troops fully trained and back on the battlefield within 2 months. Milley was expected to visit the training area in Germany on Monday to see the efforts for himself. He told reporters traveling with him to Europe over the weekend that the training, along with new weapons, including Bradley armored fighting vehicles from the US, would be really important for Ukraine to be able to defend itself. In addition to the training and weapons from the US, Britain announced over the weekend that it would become the first NATO nation to send main battle tanks to Ukraine, promising 14 of its Challenger 2 tanks, as well as other advanced artillery. First responders increased the death toll from Russia's weekend missile strike on a Ukrainian apartment building to 40 on Monday. The 9-story apartment building in Dnipro suffered a direct hit from a Russian ballistic missile Saturday evening. First responders have cleared out debris in search of survivors for days since the attack, and the death toll has risen from 23 to 40 as of Monday. Rescue efforts have also saved 39 people trapped in the debris. The Dnipro attack was part of a wave of missile strikes Russia launched into Ukraine this past weekend. In all, Russia fired 30 missiles targeting Dnipro and other major cities, but Ukrainian forces shot down more than 20 of them mid-flight. A view shows an apartment building heavily damaged by a Russian missile strike in Dnipro, Ukraine, on January 14, 2023. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the positive dynamic of his ongoing invasion of Ukraine on Sunday, just hours after the missile strike. The missile strike in Dnipro coincided with another attack on the capital of Kyiv. There, Ukrainian officials reported damage to infrastructure but no civilian casualties. Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Ihnat told Ukrainian media that the missiles most likely flew on a ballistic trajectory from north of Ukraine. He said that Ukrainian forces currently have no method of shooting down such missiles, at least not until operators have been trained in the use of US Patriot missiles, which President Joe Biden's administration is poised to deliver next week. Ukraine's General Staff reported on January 17 that Russia has also lost 3,121 tanks, 6,215 armored fighting vehicles, 2,104 artillery systems, 441 multiple launch rocket systems, 220 anti-aircraft systems, 286 planes, 276 helicopters, 1,872 drones, and 17 boats and warships. Ihnat added that more than 210 missiles of this type had already been launched at Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. The official added Kh-22 can accelerate to about 4,000 km per hour, and before hitting the target, it descends sharply, almost like a ballistic missile. The missile's circular error probable sits at around 600 meters. A Russian Kh-22 missile struck an apartment complex in Dnipro on January 14, killing at least 40 people and injuring 75, including 14 children. According to Ukraine's SBU security service, 72 apartments in the building were completely destroyed, and 236 were damaged. In addition, 25 cars were destroyed in the attack. Over 9,000 civilians, including 453 children, have been killed in Ukraine since Russia's invasion last February, a senior Ukrainian presidential aide said on Tuesday. We have registered 80,000 crimes committed by Russian invaders and over 9,000 civilians have been killed, including 453 children, Andriy Yermak, head of the Ukrainian presidential staff, said at the World Economic Forum in the Swiss resort of Davos. We will not forgive a single act of torture or life taken. Each criminal will be held accountable, he said, reiterating that Ukraine wants a special international tribunal to try Russian political leaders and reparations for the destruction caused by Russia's invasion. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said on Monday that more than 7,000 civilians had been killed in Ukraine since Russia invaded. Monday was just day 2 for Ukrainian soldiers at the US military's new training program, but the message was coming through loud and clear. These are urgent times. And the lessons they will get in the next 5 weeks on weapons, armored vehicles, and more sophisticated combat techniques are critical as they prepare to defend their country against the Russian invasion. Milley, who visited the sprawling Grafenwehr training area to get his first look at the new, so-called combined arms instruction, has said it will better prepare Ukrainian troops to launch an offensive or counter any surge in Russian attacks. He spent a bit less than 2 hours at Camp Kherson, a section of the base named after a city in Ukraine where Ukrainian troops scored a key victory against Russia last year. More than 600 Ukrainian troops began the expanded training program at the camp just a day before Milley arrived. The US has conducted training at Grafenwehr for years, including for Allied forces in Europe. But limited instruction for Ukrainian forces began last year, shortly after the Russian invasion. At the time it was focused specifically on various weapons systems that were being supplied by the US, such as the howitzer. The training at Grafenwehr is being done by the 7th Army Training Command. Speaking to 2 reporters traveling with him to Europe on Sunday, Milley said the complex training, combined with an array of new weapons, artillery, tanks, and other vehicles heading to Ukraine, will be key to helping the country's forces take back territory that has been captured by Russia in the nearly 11-month-old war. On Monday, as he walked through the training area, Milley bantered with troops, asking them about their combat experience and talking to them about their mission. The new instruction comes as Western analysts point to signs that the Kremlin is digging in for a drawn-out war, and say the Russian military command is preparing for an expanded mobilization effort. Across the battlefield, Ukrainian forces face fierce fighting in the eastern Donetsk province, where the Russian military has claimed it has control of the small salt mining town of Soledar. Ukraine asserts that its troops are still fighting, but if Moscow's troops take control of Soledar it would allow them to inch closer to the bigger city of Bakhmut, where fighting has raged for months. Russia also launched a widespread barrage of missile strikes over the weekend, including in Kyiv, the northeastern city of Kharkiv and the southeastern city of Dnipro, where the death toll in one apartment building rose to 40. A former commander of U.S. Army Europe has suggested that Ukraine will retake the Crimean Peninsula from Russia within the next year. Crimea is the large area off the southern coast of Ukraine which Moscow seized in 2014, giving Russia access to its European neighbor by the south and the east. Although Russia did not officially invade the rest of Ukraine until February 2022, for many, the annexation of Crimea is now perceived as the start of the war. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges also told Talk TV that Crimea could end up being the decisive piece of the puzzle to help Ukraine win. Kyiv has long emphasized its plan to retake all of the Ukrainian land Russia has claimed for itself but without the timeframe Hodges suggested. The West has been reluctant to offer up long-range missiles out of fear that it could provoke Russia and widen the conflict. The Donbas region is the eastern Ukrainian area where much of the fighting has taken place in recent months. There has been an ongoing dispute over grain exports leaving Ukraine since the war began, with Russia blocking ships as they attempt to exit. He also explained this is why the West needs to provide Ukraine with long-range precision weapons to strike into the heart of Russia. This would supposedly rebalance the advantage Moscow currently has with Crimea. Most of the war has taken place on Ukrainian soil, with Ukraine acting in self-defense to push Russia out. In recent months though, Kyiv has shifted its stance and sent the odd drone deep into Russian land, targeting air bases. Another strike, launched on New Year's Eve, hit the Russian-held town of Makiivka, part of one of the Ukrainian regions Moscow illegally annexed back in September. This attack even led Moscow to admit that 89 of its soldiers were killed, although Kyiv said it killed or wounded as many as 400 Russian troops in the same strike. The Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia to Crimea, was struck back in October, in an attack President Vladimir Putin dubbed a terrorist act by Ukraine at the time. Random explosions did also erupt in Crimea back in August, the first known attacks in the Russian-controlled land. At the time, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also revealed in his address that Ukraine still planned to retake the peninsula, although he stopped short of taking responsibility for that particular attack. The Russian-installed governor of Sevastopol in Crimea said on Monday that air defenses had downed 10 drones over the city in what he called a failed Ukrainian attack. Sevastopol, which is on the Crimean peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014, has come under repeated air attack since Russia invaded Ukraine last February. Russian officials have blamed the attacks on Ukraine. Governor Mikhail Razvozayev said all the drones were downed over the sea, with no damage to any infrastructure. Air Defense and the Black Sea Fleet shot down 10 out of 10 Ukrainian drones over the sea. He denied reports in Ukrainian media that there were explosions in the city, and said air defenses were continuing to monitor the skies. Ukraine has demonstrated the capacity to hit Russia with surprise attacks in Crimea, far beyond the front lines of fighting in south and eastern Ukraine, though it typically refrains from claiming responsibility. In October, Russia said Ukraine had attacked the Black Sea Fleet near Sevastopol with maritime drones which it said it managed to destroy. In August, Russia's Sakei air base in Crimea was hit by a devastating attack in which satellite imagery showed at least 8 warplanes were destroyed. Belarus exiled opposition leader said on Monday she did not think Russia would launch an offensive on Ukraine from Belarus after the two countries began military drills, but Moscow could launch more missile strikes from its allies' territory. Moscow and Minsk started joint military exercises on Monday, triggering fears in Kyiv and the West that Moscow could use its ally to launch a new ground offensive in Ukraine. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya told Reuters in an interview on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, WEF, annual meeting in Davos that she believed the drills aimed to scare the Belarus people about the possibility of war and make President Alexander Lukashenko appear to be doing everything to avoid conflict. The other purpose is to threaten the Ukrainians, distract them and turn the attention of their troops from the eastern part of the country to the northern borders, Tsikhanouskaya, who fled Belarus after a presidential election in 2020, said. Belarus says the drills are defensive and it will not enter the war, while the Kremlin has denied that it has been pressuring Lukashenko to take a more active role in the conflict in Ukraine, which it calls a special military operation. Belarus has conducted numerous military exercises since Russia's invasion began in February, both on its own and jointly with Russia. Together with Moscow, Minsk has also been bolstering the drills with weaponry and military equipment. Lukashenko, one of Putin's few firm allies, has allowed Russia to use Belarusian territory as a launch pad for missile strikes into Ukraine and a point of entry for Russian soldiers and warplanes since the start of the war on February 24 last year. President Vladimir Putin and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke by phone about exchanging men wounded in Ukraine, the creation of a gas hub in Turkey and the export of grain from the Black Sea, the Kremlin said on Monday. The exchange of views on the situation around Ukraine continued, the Kremlin said. It said the question of a prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine was raised, following talks between human rights commissioners from both countries in Turkey last week. Vladimir Putin drew attention to the destructive line of the Kyiv regime, which relies on the intensification of hostilities with the support of Western sponsors, increasing the volume of transferred weapons and military equipment, the Kremlin said in its readout of the call. It said the export of Ukrainian grain from Black Sea ports and ways to unblock fertilizer and food exports from Russia was discussed. Erdogan and Putin also talked about energy, the Kremlin said. Among the priorities is cooperation in the energy sector, including the supply of Russian natural gas and the creation of a regional gas hub in Turkey, the Kremlin said.